I normally tend to think of like exhibition as an experimental site, like in the sense that I can produce new work, but also investigate, things that I'm interested in. It's unusual for me to make an exhibition which is mainly consisting of existing works, but I think the characteristics of these works makes them mobile and also makes them adaptable to other contexts. And also it's interesting for me to see existing works with new works and see how this because it's a new setting and a new relation these works establish with each other. But it was not an easy task, I must say. So during the pandemic, let's say the pandemic years, I've only concentrated on one project that is called the Homemaker and the Domain, and this project is subdivided in 3 different projects. And the Homemaker and her Domain is a quote by Charlotte Perrien, and she wrote this text in the 30s called The Homemaker and Domain for a magazine called Vendredi, and she basically speaks about the dysfunctionalities and the absurdities of living in Paris in those years.
We're surrounded here by one of these, in a way they feel like temporary shelters of some kind. They could relate to exhibition stands or made of bamboo, but within that there are several works. The references to Charlotte Perrien and the padded cushions that she made for a chaise longue, plus a couple of works that again relate to woven structures by Trude Guermont-Prez, who was a Bauhaus weaver who migrated to the United States. I think it'd be really interesting to hear you speak about how you see this relationship to these historical figures.
I'm interested in this period of time of modernism, but I think these people really, did a break with it. And I think I'm interested in this because they are much more flexible. They work within range of other materials. They're interested in, other lexicons. So that's what interests me. It's not modernism in itself, but what they did within that time. But the reason I was interested in Perrien was the fact that she goes and travels to Japan, and she's responsible for bringing the Japanese kind of crafts into the Western world.
It's interesting how the works are very mutable. I mean, they change because you've substituted or seem to be able to, within your system, to substitute certain elements for other elements, but also in different contexts, I guess they have different associations. And I'm really struck by the exhibition here where you've placed these works. We are sitting on one of your floors. This is a floor that's derived from a rug that was made by Marion Pepler. So another designer who's been added, I guess, to your cast. A British designer working in the 1930s. And how did you kind of come upon Pepler? Because she's a very little known figure here.
I must say I was quite ignorant about the context of Scotland, and I tried to, search things that could interest me in this kind of lexicon that I created. So I thought, what can I bring to this merge of interests? And then I started looking into Marion Pepler's work, and I thought it would be interesting to have one of her patterns on the floor. The work needs to be lifted from the ground, otherwise it really sinks down. So it needs like a kind of a floating, I like to think of this as a floating thing because it's a floating floor. It's a parquet floor, which can be, put in any kind of surface. So for me, this is just like floating. It's not, but for me, this is just like floating on the floor. But also it's a way of unifying things in space.
You also have made another floor for the upstairs gallery, another Pepler design. they certainly bear no obvious resemblance to the rug on which they're based. The materials have changed so radically.
But the drawing is, I don't change anything. I change the materials, and I change, but I don't change the drawing. I just enlarge it. Also thinking of, like, when you think of classical sculpture and then enlarging from the, small thing. It's really, I think it's really a thought on sculpture in itself.
I mean, again, you've got a fairly disparate range or array of objects upstairs, including these 3 low structures called the Charlotte. They're based on tables, but they're very low, and they have a very strange
Dysfunctional
presence, maybe. They're strange materially speaking as well. They have a strange material presence there.
Yeah, it's the first time actually I do a sculpture that is so contained in itself. But so they are based on tables, and basically some of them just sketches that Perrin did in Japan, and they're made of slashes of clay that they have imprints of woven mats. It's very contradictory in a way, and I wanted to have this sense of printing on clay.
In the warehouse, you've done something rather different. Thinking about the building in a very particular way. And I wondered if you could say a little bit about, there's a density to the work that you've brought together, mainly the hanging pieces. Can you talk a little bit about the form of those hanging pieces and the different materials that they're made out of?
The warehouse, I think it's a rather interesting place, and I thought I want to work with it as a cathedral. It's so beautiful to be able to, to suspend things at that height. And I think I wanted to show like this kind of lexicon of sculptures that I've been doing in these last years, part of which is called random intersections, which are driven by horse bridles and bridles that I've been collecting throughout these years, and I replicate them and I change them and then I group them, and then they get tangled and they kind of lose their reference. But I think the warehouse was also a space where a lot of this sense of this gravity of these objects falling into the room. So I thought about like this idea of using, so I often use rope, and rope for me is like also a unity of measure, but also like how can I construct forms and space within this idea of the line. So just this idea of like the twisting of the rope and how you create volumes with it.
It feels like, even though you brought some older work to it, it feels to me just as much a kind of experiment as any of the other projects in a way. Well, I hope it has felt like that.
Yeah, totally. I've never installed so many hanging sculptures together. And I think it's interesting to see how these things, they have another life, They have a different life here than they had before.
For sure.
And it's very interesting for me. It's like making new work as well.